Raids in WoW have evolved and changed as the years have passed. New expansions have released and paved the way for new types of gameplay as well. When I think about all the raids of WoW's past, one sticks out in the change department more than others, and that of course is Naxxramas. Naxxramas was a 40-man raid released during the original version of World of Warcraft and its last raid, prior to the Burning Crusade, releasing during patch 1.1 properly named Shadow of the Necropolis. Hovering over the Eastern Plaguelands, the original vanilla WoW version of Naxx was notorious for its more detailed raiding mechanics compared to what we had dealt with so far, pretty much starting raiding down the trend of more complicated raid bosses, but also it was mostly known for its extremely ramped up difficulty, so much so that most guilds didn't even experience all or even some of the raid. Naxx also incorporated a very unique non-linear raid design that helped encourage players to tackle different sections of the raid at their own pace and gear levels. Naxxramas would eventually move at the beginning of the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. Interestingly enough, Kel'thuzad actually foreshadowed this movement as well in his original voice lines for the 40-man raid.
Do not rejoice. Your victory is a hollow one, for I shall return with powers beyond your imagining.
Making its major comeback in Dragonblight this time, the raid changed its format entirely for raiders, being an entry-level raid with Obsidian Sanctum and Eye of Eternity. It was now a 25 and 10-man tier raid. Blizzard naturally opted to tune it more comfortably for all the players to get a chance to experience the insane juggernaut that was Naxx. I kinda figured now would be the best time as any to talk about the differences between the Naxx original 40-man version and the newer 25 and 10-man versions released in Wrath. Naturally, a lot of YouTubers have talked about some of these differences, but usually they focus on one or two really big ones, like the infamous mechanics around the Four Horsemen. I want to delve a little deeper and try to cover a few more mechanics than that and try to give everyone a chance to see what the original 40-man Naxx was like, but also, if you've never experienced the 25 and 10-mans, a look at them as well. Naturally, I won't cover every little thing, but instead hit on some of the major high points. So, I hope you enjoy this video. Let's take a look at Naxxramas' differences from then to now.
Who dares violate the sanctity of my domain? You have no idea what horrors lie ahead. You have seen nothing. The frozen heart of Naxxramas awaits you. Scream your dying breath.
You have failed, pathetic wretch!
Foolishly you have sought your own demise. Brazenly you have disregarded powers beyond your understanding.
I do hope they stay alive long enough for me to introduce myself.
Eat your bones. Break you. I'm just getting warmed up. I hear little hearts beating. Beating faster now. Soon the beating will stop. The races of the world will perish. It is only a matter of time.
Right out the gate, I already covered one of the larger differences, and that is the location. The original version of Naxx was floating high above the Eastern Plaguelands, whereas the newer version introduced in Wrath was located high above Dragonblight. Another notable difference is how you actually entered the locations. While you could use flying or summoning to enter the new version of Naxxramas, flying wasn't available in vanilla WoW, being added in Burning Crusade. Instead, a teleporter was used deep in Eastern Plaguelands to port the player to the Necropolis. Another massive difference was the requirements for entering the raid itself. The newer version of Naxx had no pre-requirements other than being max level, and either having flying or being summoned onto the Dread Citadel itself, whereas the original required Argent Dawn reputation in order to use the teleporter. This attunement could be quite a slog, and while Exalted wasn't necessary, buying said attunement was pricey for its time period, and gaining Exalted removed any kind of cost to attune. The lack of attunement in the new version was surprising for most players, as it changed how things would roll going forward with entering raids, especially considering there was a newly added Argent Crusade rep that could have been used for an attunement process. Instead, Blizzard opted to not use attunement at all, and completely changed the face of how we entered raids going forward. While this has been more common knowledge as of recent, the original Naxx was also planned to feature an entrance which would have been located deep within Stratholme, past the end of the instance we have now, similar to Blackrock Depths and Molten Core. This, however, was dropped prior to Naxx's launch, as the development team felt forcing players through Stratholme would be far too sluggish, and was eventually opted out of. Outside of the raid wasn't the only part to experience changes. The inside received quite a variety of unique changes as well, even with the overall layout remaining pretty much the same. The 4 wings are still intact just as they were in the 40-man version, but interestingly the biggest change to them was actually their names. The original wings of Naxx were known by the player base as the Abomination, Death Knight, Spider, and Plague wings. But as for the 10 and 25-man versions, were updated to be the Construct, Military, Arachnid, and Plague quarters. Yeah, Plague didn't change much. Of course, Blizzard was also nice enough to give us an in-game actual map. As this wasn't actually available in the original version, this was a pretty handy little tool to have. The original 40-man Naxx also featured several specialty items that would not make it into the later version of the raid. The first of these items is the Frost Rune, an item that was located throughout the raid that had to be farmed and was a consumable that could be used to nullify frost damage. However, its important use was that it could be used to forge frost-resistant gear needed for fighting Sapphiron. In addition to this, there was also the Splinters of Atish. Atish was a legendary staff available to casting classes during this time period, and in order to make it you had to collect splinters off the bosses, very similar to the fragments for Valinir and Ulduar. The legendary staff would not reappear, nor would the frost runes in the new version of Naxx. There was no staff, so no need for splinters, and Sapphiron was very well easy enough to heal through, so no longer were you needing to use frost resistance gear either. In addition to these specialty items, loot was also quite a bit different. Naxx 40 featured a large scale amount of unique sprites that to some extent would return in the newer version of the raid. Like the sword Hungering Cold that dropped off Kel'thuzad himself, that would later be changed to the tanking sword Slayer of the Lifeless that dropped off Gothic and Gluth. Both of them shared the same sprite, but completely different weapons, so kinda neat. And a large amount of weapons received this treatment. While a large amount of the weapons did receive this treatment though, not all of Naxx 40's sprites made a return. The famous Corrupted Ashbringer comes to mind, a really awesome novelty two-handed sword and one of my favorite weapons in WoW history that dropped off 4 horsemen, but sadly was never brought back in the 25 and 10-man versions, making it quite a rare find, especially considering the boss it dropped off of. Other known weapons that didn't make a comeback in the newer version include the Plague Bearer Shield, a really awesome staff called Soulseeker, and the arguably biggest weapon in WoW history, the Maul of the Redeemed Crusader. Of course, the newer version of Naxx featured its own unique sprites as well. Including most of the 25 Naxx weapons and armor, KT in particular featured a huge array of weapons like the Turning Tide and Calamity's Grasp that all possess sprites new to the raid. Of course, with the shift into a new raiding tier, the old Tier 3 featured in Naxx 40 was removed and replaced with the smaller Tiers 7 and 7.5 from Naxx 10 and 25. The Tier 7 sets actually featured the original Tier 3 designs, but with different colors, and the 7.5s continued this color changing theme, but with slight additions to the actual design, to help make them more unique for the players. One other important thing to note is that Tier 3 is, to this date, the only raiding tier to feature a ring in its set, making it a very rare item to come across, especially since it's not transmoggable, and more so because the rings actually dropped off the final boss himself, Kel'Thuzad. Alright, let's talk about the bosses and other enemies throughout the raid. One of the larger differences for those familiar with the original raid was the major design differences for the trash throughout. The original 40-man Naxx had more basic designs utilizing older undead zombie models and sprites, and standard human models with more relevant armors for the time. Whereas the new version of the raid featured more updated undead models including newer Death Knights, such as the Tauren and Night Elf ones you see throughout, as well as mobs like the Stitch Giants that were added in Wrath of the Lich King that replaced a lot of the abominations. The trash's location actually changed quite a bit as well. In the 25 and 10-man versions, for instance, The additional sections of the wings that players normally don't go to featured only the area trash for that section. For instance, Death Knight area would only feature Death Knight trash, but in the original 40-man it was actually a mixture of trash. These areas were also used for finding frost runes, and once the frost runes were removed, players really didn't utilize these extra sections, making them pretty much husks of what they used to be. Bosses featured some of the largest changes out of anything, so I figured I'd take some time and actually look at some of the bosses that had some pretty major changes, whether it be positioning or mechanics. Right out the gate, damage is a big changer for each of these bosses. For instance, Anubra Khan's Locust Swarm did upwards to 1200 damage every couple seconds in the 40-man, versus 25-man version which did, well, not actually that much more than that. Now consider the HP at the time of the original Naxx was only a few thousand for most people, versus the 25-man version where players were sitting at 16 to 20,000 HP, and well, you can see the scaling difference right there. I mean, 1200 damage would kill you very quickly in the 40-man, versus 12 to 1500 damage doing very little to you in the 25 or 10-man version. Naturally, you wouldn't want to stand in this in any version, but you can clearly see that you had little mistake room in the 40-man version. And this is actually common with all of the bosses. In the 40-man version, things with most bosses were usually handled with a lot more seriousness, and mistakes were way more punishing. Another huge change from the 40-man to the 10 and 25 was the need to use resistance-based items. I already mentioned Saffron and the Frost Resist gear, but in addition, bosses like Lotheb were also known for needing Shadow Resist potions to help survive the massive damage done throughout his fight. Gluth, the Construct Pooch, featured several mechanics that had to be handled completely different from his future fight. He actually frenzied just like he now does, but the frenzy actually had to be trank shotted in order for your tank to not die. He also had an AoE fear that's completely absent in the new versions of the raid that made the boss fight a complete hectic mess. Thaddeus had his own unique changes. While his fight directly featured the same mechanics for the most part, how you handled it was greatly changed. In the new version, it was common for a polarity shift to happen and the players to either run under Thaddeus or just run around him. Crossing the polarities was not nearly as dangerous, but in the 40-man it pretty much spelled a wipe if you crossed any single opposite debuff. Often raids would form two groups, one on each side of the boss, positive and negative, but instead of players individually moving to the opposite side, the groups themselves would generally reform with one debuff moving to the south and the other moving to the north of the boss, basically starting the mechanic all over again in new locations, and then vice versa again back to the left and right of the boss after the new debuff goes out. This meant the raid itself had to be far more malleable and ready to move at any one moment instead of just individual punishment. It was a punishment on a far more large scale. Noth the Plaguebringer still dished out his curses like no one's business, but missing any of the purges was not an option and would quickly lead to a raid wipe instantly. Hygen the Unclean is one of the few bosses in the raid to actually feature additional phases or more major changes to his encounter. The dance still remained intact, but the gauntlet leading to Lotheb was actually used during his actual fight, and random players would actually be teleported there and have to escape it to rejoin the ongoing encounter against Hygen. This was most likely removed from the 25 and 10-man version due to the dance already being expected to be fairly challenging for new raiders, and well, a lot of people failed at the dance, so it was probably a solid call on their part. Lotheb altogether actually worked pretty similar to the original encounter, but his healing effect worked far different. Instead of the Naxx 10 and 25-man versions featuring a debuff that prevented healing every 15 seconds, the original iteration of Lotheb actually just allowed one healing spell per minute, putting an insane strain on the damage to pick up the slack and end the boss as soon as possible. But also, as mentioned earlier, consumable shadow resistance potions were mandatory for surviving his high ramping damage from Shadow Aura. This also put a mega strain on healers, as delegating a healer to the tank was priority number one. That was pretty much all you could heal at that moment. You had to dedicate that one heal to keeping your tank alive, and the raid pretty much had to manage themselves. Instructor Raz actually had some pretty big differences, but surprisingly on the 10-man side. The 25-man side maintained a lot of the similarities to the original encounter, at least the best it could, with the exception of some minor changes and scaling. The 10-man encounter actually completely changed the mechanic though. In the original and 25-man encounter, a Shadow Priest or Priestess needed to mind control the understudies to tank the boss, as he hits far too hard for a regular tank to take it. However, in the 10-man version, two mechanics are added for the players to click to actually mind control the ads, meaning that you don't actually need a priest to do this. This was most likely added because getting a priest for a 10-man core would have been far more challenging for players in a newer environment. No one was guaranteed to have a priest, and, well, I think Blizzard was just trying to make it a lot easier for players. Ah, the Four Horsemen, the Legacy, the infamous quad themselves. One of the most obvious differences in the Horsemen is the change of their leader. Originally led by the Paladin turned Death Knight High Lord Mograine, also known as the Ashbringer, he was actually replaced in the newer version by the infamous Stratholme final boss Baron Rivendare. Naturally, most players know this, but how the bosses work changed the actual raid format from its standard formation. The boss upon starting the encounter aggroed and each required a tank, but due to a stacking debuff, the tank could not hold the boss for terribly long before being one-shotted, requiring a second tank per each boss, as too many of each dot would be detrimental to the tank's health. So in total, that's 2 tanks per each of the 4 bosses, making 8. Yup, 8 tanks, a record that only this boss has ever had. This put a stress on most guilds in 40-man raiding, as they naturally didn't carry this many tanks, and involved a lot of back-gearing new tanks for this one encounter, or the more notable choice, but far crueler, tank poaching from other guilds. This often led to a lot of guilds disbanding as they no longer had the core tanks needed to even do basic content. Naturally, the newer version did not need 8 tanks. In fact, it only needed 2 tanks, as only 2 horsemen are tankable by normal means, the other 2 flee to the back corners and are merely needed to be tanked by a player within a certain radius of them, to apply their debuffs and avoid wiping the raid. This role could easily be filled by a healer and ranged class, as the healer didn't take that much damage and could easily heal both participants. I mentioned that the other 2 knights flee to the back corner, but it's important to note that this feature didn't exist in the original 40-man version. Each knight became aggroable and were moved by each tank manually, making the encounter start out already 2 times more challenging than the new versions. In addition to the tanking needs, the 4 horsemen also had a few tricks up their sleeves, including shield walling at low percentages to make the fight last even longer, and a very unique mechanic of forming into a ghost upon death to continue applying their debuffs to nearby opponents. This made positioning in the 40-man version very key. In speaking of positioning, this boss had some impressive raid formations needed to tackle it. Raids often tank the bosses in the farthest parts of each corner of the room to maximize where the dots would be applied. Healing teams were then generally formed near the stairs, away from where the dot radius could reach, to heal up nearby party members as they switched between bosses. This allowed them to continue into the fray as soon as they were topped off, as they would be taking more damage soon, and it avoided them dying from unnecessary dot damage. Saffron, as mentioned earlier, needed a special frost rune crafted armor to resist his damaging frost aura, but in addition, in the 40-man version, dispelling his drain life was a must, and the tail swipe and frontal cleave were far too deadly to be mistakenly hit by. Kel'thuzad himself also shared some unique feature changes. The intro ad phase was far more crushing on players and required proper skill and coordination to deal with, as the ads could not simply be bursted down. Once transitioned into KT himself, things like his single target frostbolt had to be interrupted to avoid one-shotting the tank, and mind controls were far more dangerous and rapid than in the newer version. Interestingly, the mind control mechanic is actually completely absent in the 10-man version. The ice block mechanic actually totaled at 130% in the original 40-man version, making it a healing priority, and while this continued on into the newer versions, the damage was lowered on the blocks, making them slightly easier to manage, and with a smaller raid size, the chaining effect the ice blocks caused was not as common, as where in the original version it could easily lead to a wipe if too many ice blocks were chained at all. Handling mana detonations in the original 40-man was also far more taxing. Mana was not easy to get back in the original raids, and so because of that, losing it, for any reason whatsoever, was very detrimental to your healing in your core. Once low enough, KT would summon 5 Guardians of Icecrown instead of 4 or 2 like in the new versions of the raid. They stack a damaging self buff upon switching targets, forcing off-tanks to handle them with extra care, and oftentimes the raids ended up CCing them with Shackle Undead, to avoid a wipe, whereas they were just held by an off-tank or sometimes the main tank in the newer version. Hey, did you enjoy the video? Think of any differences maybe I missed that you enjoyed? Go ahead and drop them in the comments. I'm always down to read them and share them. It's always good to spread information. If you did enjoy the content, don't forget to subscribe and check out some of our other videos. We do WoW, Overwatch, Diablo, anything Blizzard pretty much. And hey, I'm Captain Potato. I'll see you guys next time, next video.